Ford's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. 6 months. How could this be? He had conquered markets, crushed competitors, and built a legacy that stretched across continents. Yet he was powerless against this. Dr. Mina continued, his voice softer now. It's best you start preparing, Mr. Okafor. If there's anything unfinished in your life, now is the time to set things right. Unfinished. Ford's gaze drifted to the window, the skyline of Lagos stretching beyond. His wealth, his empire, none of it mattered if he had no one to leave it to. He had spent years keeping people at arm's length, too consumed by ambition to nurture real relationships. Now he was alone. A sharp knock on the door jolted him. His personal assistant, Charles, stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir, should I clear your schedule for the day?" Ford exhaled, rubbing his temple. "No, keep everything as it is." He refused to let this diagnosis dictate his life. Not yet. As Charles nodded and turned to leave, Ford spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Wait." Charles paused. "Find me my lawyer." "And?" Ford hesitated, the words foreign on his tongue. "Find someone. Someone who can bear me an heir." Charles blinked, but he recovered quickly. "Sir." "You heard me," Ford said, steel returning to his voice. "I don't have time for love or marriage. But I need an heir. Someone I can trust." His jaw clenched. "Discreetly." Charles nodded, his face unreadable. "Understood, sir." As the door closed behind him, Ford leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion creeping in. He had spent his life making ruthless decisions. This would be no different. Little did he know, fate had already placed the right person in his home. In the servants' quarters of his Lagos estate, Adiz, his quiet and hard-working maid, was scrubbing the marble floors, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. Adiz moved swiftly, her hands gliding over the cool marble floors of Ford Okafor's grand estate. She had worked here for nearly 2 years, keeping to herself, doing her job without complaint. The mansion was a world of wealth and luxury she would never belong to, but that didn't matter. She was here to earn a living, to support her younger siblings back in their village. As she finished polishing the hallway, she heard hurried footsteps approaching. She looked up just as Charles, Mr. Okafor's ever-serious assistant, stopped in front of her. "Adiz," he said, his tone unreadable. She quickly stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir. Come with me." Adiz's heart pounded. Had she done something wrong? Had someone accused her of stealing? She had seen other staff dismissed without warning, their belongings tossed out before they could even say a word in their defense. Silently, she followed Charles through the long corridors until they reached the grand double doors of Mr. Okafor's study. Charles knocked once before pushing them open. Ford sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face unreadable. But there was something different about him today. He looked tired, not just physically but in a way that went deeper. His sharp, commanding presence seemed dulled by an invisible weight. "Sir," Adiz said softly, bowing her head in respect. Ford studied her for a long moment. She had always been efficient, invisible in the way good servants were trained to be. But now, as he truly looked at her, he saw something else. Strength, quiet resilience, and a kind of beauty that wasn't loud or demanding. "I need your help," he said abruptly. Adiz's eyes widened. "My help?" Ford exhaled, as if bracing himself. "I need an heir." Silence. Adiz blinked, sure she had misheard. "Sir, I don't have time for a wife, for courtship, for love." His voice was calm, controlled. "I need a child. And I need someone I can trust to carry that child." His piercing gaze locked onto hers. "That's where you come in." A cold shiver ran down Adiz's spine. "You want me?" "Yes." She took a shaky breath. "But why me?" Ford leaned back in his chair. "Because you're loyal. You've worked in my home for years, never asking for anything beyond your wages. You have no ulterior motives. And most importantly, he paused, his voice turning firm, you need money. Dees flinched. It was true. She sent every kobo she earned back home, scraping by with the bare minimum for herself. But this was different. If you agree, Ford continued, I will ensure your family never struggles again. I will set up a trust fund for you and the child. You will live comfortably for the rest of your life. Dee's throat tightened. It was a deal unlike any other. Security, wealth, a chance to give her family a better life. But at what cost? Her voice wavered. I don't know if I can do this. Ford's eyes darkened, but not with anger. It was something else, something almost vulnerable. Think about it, Dees. I don't have time to waste. He turned away, as if dismissing her. Charles stepped forward, guiding her out of the study. As the doors closed behind her, Dee's world tilted on its axis. She had come here to work as a maid. Now, she was being asked to become the mother of a billionaire's child. And she had no idea what to do. Dees sat on the edge of her small bed in the servants' quarters, her hands trembling in her lap. The air in the tiny room felt heavy, suffocating. She replayed Ford Okafor's words over and over. I need an heir. You need money. I will ensure your family never struggles again. She had come to Lagos for a better life, to send her siblings to school, to make sure her sick mother never had to work another day. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. How could she agree to such a thing? To bear a child for a man who felt nothing for her, a man who only saw her as a solution to his problem. And yet, how could she refuse? Her mother's frail voice echoed in her mind. You are the hope of this family, Dees. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see her best friend, Amaka, standing in the doorway. You look like you've seen a ghost, Amaka said, stepping inside and closing the door. What happened? Dees hesitated. Could she even tell anyone? But this was Amaka, her closest friend in this house. She swallowed hard. Mr. Okafor, he made me an offer. Amaka frowned. What kind of offer? Dees took a shaky breath. He wants me to have his child. Silence. Amaka's eyes widened. What? He's dying, Dees whispered. He doesn't have much time left. He needs an heir and he chose me. Amaka sat down beside her, gripping her hands. Dees, this is insane. You're just a maid to him. Why would he? She stopped, realization dawning. Because he knows you won't betray him. You're quiet, obedient, and you need money. Dees nodded slowly. She didn't have the luxury of saying no. But if she was going to do this, she had to do it wisely. Taking a deep breath, she stood. I need to speak to Mr. Okafor. Amaka's eyes searched hers. Are you saying yes? Dees' heart pounded. I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out exactly what this deal means, before I agree to anything. She squared her shoulders and left the room, her mind made up. If she was going to change her life, she had to do it on her own terms. Dees' hands trembled as she knocked on the heavy doors of Ford Okafor's study. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she steeled herself. She wasn't just a maid tonight. She was a woman making the most important decision of her life. Enter, came Ford's deep, commanding voice. She stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight of him. He sat behind his desk, his piercing eyes studying her as if he already knew why she had come. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. You've made a decision, he said, more of a statement than a question. Dees swallowed. Not yet. But I have questions. Ford leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to continue. If I do this, she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens to me? What happens after the child is born? Ford's expression remained unreadable. You will be well compensated. You and the child will be taken care of financially for life. That's not what I meant, Dees said, surprising herself with her boldness. Will I be just a mother to your child? Or will I be your wife? A flicker of something surprise. crossed Ford's face. He hadn't expected her to ask that. "I don't have time for marriage," he said finally. "This is a business arrangement. I need an heir and you need security." Adi's stomach twisted. It was exactly what she had feared. He didn't see her as a person, just as a means to an end. She lifted her chin. "Then I have my own conditions." Ford arched an eyebrow. "Go on. If I do this, I won't just be some disposable woman you pay off once the baby is born. I want legal security, not just for the child but for myself." Ford tilted his head, intrigued. "What exactly are you asking for?" Adiz steadied her breath. "Marriage. A contract that ensures I won't be cast aside once you get what you want. If I bear your child, I will be your wife. At least until," she hesitated, her throat tightening, "until you're gone." Silence filled the room. Ford's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse. But then he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he murmured. Adiz held his gaze. "I'm not stupid, Mr. Okafor. I know the risks." A slow, almost reluctant smile played on his lips. "Fine. We marry. You will be my wife until my time runs out." His voice grew colder. "But don't expect love, Adiz. This is not a fairy tale." Her chest ached at his words, but she forced herself to nod. "I understand." Ford exhaled, as if sealing his fate. "Then we have a deal." Adiz felt her world tilt. She had just agreed to marry a dying billionaire, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, Adiz sat in a leather chair in Ford Okafor's study, her heart pounding as she watched his lawyer spread a stack of documents before her. Ford sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He was always composed, always in control, but today, there was a strange intensity in his gaze, as if he were testing her. Mr. Jacobs, the gray-haired lawyer, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "This contract outlines the terms of your marriage, Miss Adiz. As agreed, you will be legally wed to Mr. Okafor until his passing. Upon his death, you and the child will inherit a portion of his estate." Adiz swallowed hard. "How much?" Mr. Jacobs glanced at Ford, who gave a curt nod. The lawyer turned back to her. $10 million. Adiz's breath hitched. $10 million. It was more money than she could ever dream of. More than enough to change her life, to lift her family out of poverty forever. But the weight of it pressed on her. This wasn't just about money. This was about becoming a billionaire's wife. A man who had no interest in love. "What else?" she asked, her voice steady. Mr. Jacobs flipped to another page. "You will bear his child. In exchange, you will be given a monthly allowance and access to his resources during the marriage. However," he hesitated, then continued, "you will have no claim to his company, Okafor Enterprises. All business decisions will remain under the board's control." That didn't bother Adiz. She had no interest in his empire. But one thing did bother her. "What happens if I fail to conceive?" she asked, meeting Ford's gaze. His expression remained unreadable. "Then the contract is void, and you walk away with nothing." A shiver ran down her spine. This was all or nothing. Adiz's hands clenched in her lap. She had always dreamed of marrying for love, of finding a man who adored her. But life had never given her the luxury of dreams. This was survival. "I need to think," she whispered. Ford's gaze darkened. "You don't have time to think." Adiz's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I don't have time, Adiz," he said, his voice colder now. 6 months. Maybe less. That's all I have. You either take this deal now, or I find someone else." His words stung, but she understood. This wasn't love. This was business. Adiz looked down at the contract, at the lines of ink that would change her life forever. Then, with a deep breath, she picked up the pen and signed her name. This chapter adds more tension and finality to Adiz's decision. The stakes are higher now. She's in, but at what cost? Let me know if you want to explore Ford's emotions more or add twists. The ceremony was cold, efficient, and over in less than 15 minutes. Adiz stood in front of the magistrate, her hands trembling as she repeated the vows that felt hollow in her mouth. She wore a simple white dress Ford's assistant had arranged for her. Nothing extravagant, nothing like the fairy tale wedding she had once dreamed of as a little girl. Ford stood beside her, dressed in an expensive black suit, his face a mask of indifference. He was calm, detached, as if he were signing a business deal rather than marrying a woman who would bear his child. "You may kiss the bride," the magistrate announced. Adiz stiffened. Ford turned to her, his sharp eyes unreadable. For a brief moment, she thought he might skip it entirely. But then he leaned in, pressing a quick, emotionless kiss against her lips before pulling away. It was over. She was now Mrs. Adiz Okafor. The handful of witnesses, Ford's lawyer, his assistant, and Amaka, whom Adiz had begged to be there, clapped politely. There was no celebration, no reception, no warmth. Just signatures on a paper and a transaction sealed. As they exited the courthouse, a sleek black Rolls-Royce waited at the curb. Charles, Ford's assistant, opened the door for them. "We should head to the estate," Ford said, his voice as cold as ever. Adiz hesitated. "That's it." Ford's gaze flickered over to her. "Did you expect a honeymoon?" The harshness in his tone made her flinch. She lowered her gaze. "No, of course not." Without another word, she stepped into the car. Ford followed, sitting beside her, his body tense. The ride back to the estate was silent, filled with an invisible wall between them. Adiz stole a glance at her new husband. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as if he regretted this already. And maybe he did. She had just married a dying billionaire. And for the first time, the reality of it all crashed down on her like a wave. She wasn't his wife. She was just a contract. And in 6 months, she would be a widow. The Okafor estate was vast, a sprawling mansion that felt more like a palace than a home. As the Rolls-Royce pulled up to the grand entrance, Adiz's heart pounded. She had spent years as a maid, quietly moving through the halls, cleaning rooms she was never allowed to rest in. But now, she was the lady of the house. Or at least that's what the title said. Ford stepped out first, buttoning his jacket as Charles, his assistant, rushed to open the door for Adiz. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out, the weight of her new life settling on her shoulders. The staff lined up in quiet formation, waiting to greet their new mistress. Some of them were familiar faces, people she had worked alongside. Their expressions were carefully blank, but she could feel their silent judgment. She had been one of them just days ago. Now she was their boss. "Welcome home, Mrs. Okafor," Charles said politely. Adiz forced a smile, but Ford's voice cut through the moment. "Prepare the master bedroom for me," he ordered. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And prepare a separate room for my wife." Adiz's breath caught. Separate rooms. Course. This wasn't a real marriage. Without another word, Ford strode inside, his long strides full of purpose. Adiz followed, but as soon as she stepped into the grand marble foyer, Amaka appeared at her side. "Are you okay?" Amaka whispered. Adiz's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know." Amaka squeezed her hand before pulling away. "Stay strong." But how could she? She had married a dying man for security, and now she was stepping into a life where she wasn't a wife, just an obligation. Adiz lifted her chin and followed Ford inside. No matter what, she would survive this. She had to. Adiz sat on the edge of her new bed, staring at the luxurious surroundings of the room she had been given. It was beautiful, far grander than anything she had ever known. The curtains were silk, the furniture polished mahogany, and the bed was enormous. And yet it felt empty. She had expected this, but the cold reality still stung. Ford had placed her in a separate room, making it clear that their marriage was nothing more than an agreement. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said hesitantly. The door opened and Ford stepped inside, his sharp gaze unreadable. He was still in his wedding suit, but he had loosened his tie, making him look less like the intimidating billionaire and more like a weary man carrying the weight of the world. "We need to talk," he said. Adi's heart pounded as she nodded. "Okay." Ford stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I won't pretend this is a real marriage, and I won't ask you to pretend either." His voice was calm, businesslike. "Our arrangement is simple," he continued. "You will live here as my wife in the public eye. You will attend events with me when necessary. But behind closed doors, we are nothing more than two people bound by a contract." Adi swallowed hard. She had known this, but hearing it so plainly made her chest tighten. "I understand," she said quietly. Ford studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You will have everything you need: money, security, comfort. But there are rules." She met his gaze. "What rules?" "No personal questions," he said firmly. "We don't discuss my past, my business, or my health. I don't need pity, and I don't need company." Adi's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. "And the child?" Ford's expression darkened slightly. "That is the only thing that matters in this arrangement. We will try, and once you are pregnant, we will decide how things proceed." The way he said it, so detached, so emotionless, made her stomach turn. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ford hesitated. For the first time, his cold mask seemed to crack just a little. But then he straightened, his face hardening again. "No," he said simply. "That's all." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Adiz found herself speaking. "Why me?" Ford stopped but didn't turn around. "Out of all the women in the world, why did you choose me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because you don't ask for anything." And just like that, he walked out, leaving Adiz alone in her cold, luxurious prison. The days blurred into a strange routine. Adiz woke up in her luxurious room, ate breakfast alone, and wandered the vast estate like a ghost. Ford was either locked in his study, working, or attending meetings outside. They barely spoke beyond polite necessities. To the world they were newlyweds. To each other they were strangers. But the most uncomfortable part, the looming expectation of fulfilling the contract. She knew what she had agreed to. And yet, every night, she lay awake, wondering when Ford would finally come to her. Would he be cold, detached? Or was there a man beneath his armor, someone softer, hidden behind his walls? She got her answer 3 weeks after the wedding. The night Ford came to her. Adiz was sitting on the chaise lounge in her room, wrapped in a silk robe, when a quiet knock sounded at her door. Her pulse spiked. She knew who it was. Taking a deep breath, she stood and opened the door. Ford stood there, dressed in black lounge pants and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the top. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a storm restrained but present. "May I come in?" he asked. Adiz swallowed and nodded, stepping aside. He walked in, looking around as if this were the first time he had truly acknowledged the space she lived in. Then he turned to her, his expression guarded. "This arrangement," he began, his voice low, "we have to move forward with it." Adiz's fingers clenched at her robe. "I know." Beat of silence. Then Ford exhaled and rubbed a hand down his face. "I don't expect romance, Adiz. You know that." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "And I don't expect love." Something flickered in his eyes, gone too quickly to decipher. Ford stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Adiz's breath hitched, but she didn't move back. This was it. The moment everything would change. And then, he stopped. Ford's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides. He took a step back, exhaling sharply. "I can't do this," he muttered. Adiz's heart stuttered. "What?" Ford turned away, his broad shoulders tense. "Not like this." Confusion swirled inside her. You were the one who said. I know what I said, he snapped, then sighed. But I won't treat you like a transaction. Dees blinked, stunned. Was this guilt? Hesitation? Did he care even a little? Ford turned to her again, his face a war zone of emotions. We'll take this at your pace, he said quietly. When you're ready. I'll be ready. And with that he walked out, leaving Dees breathless, confused, and wondering if maybe Ford Okafor wasn't as heartless as he wanted the world to believe. Dees barely slept that night. Ford's words replayed in her mind over and over. I won't treat you like a transaction. She had expected him to be cold, detached, maybe even ruthless about fulfilling their agreement. But instead he had pulled back. Why? She wasn't naive enough to believe he cared for her, but for the first time, she saw something in him that didn't fit the hardened billionaire image. Hesitation. A restraint. And that terrified her more than if he had just gone through with it. The distance between them. The next morning, Dees expected things to be awkward, but Ford acted as if nothing had happened. He sat across from her at breakfast, calmly drinking his coffee while reading the newspaper. She, on the other hand, could barely touch her food. Are you not eating? His voice was neutral, but there was a flicker of concern in his gaze. Dees hesitated before shaking her head. Not very hungry. Ford set down his coffee and studied her. You'll need to take care of yourself if we're going to have a child. Her stomach twisted. But the contract. The only reason she was here. Dees forced a small smile. I know. Ford nodded once, as if satisfied, then returned to his paper. For the rest of the day, he disappeared into his study, and Dees wandered the house aimlessly. By evening, she found herself in the garden, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. She had always loved this part of the estate, the one place that felt untouched by wealth and power. The flowers didn't care about money or status. They simply bloomed. She had just closed her eyes, enjoying the silence, when a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. You like it here. Dees turned and found Ford standing a few feet away. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, just a simple black sweater and trousers. It was the first time he looked normal, human. She nodded. It's peaceful. Ford walked closer, stopping beside her. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the flowers with an unreadable expression. Then softly he said, My mother used to love this garden. Dees' breath hitched. This was the first time Ford had ever shared something personal with her. She turned to look at him, but his gaze was distant, lost in memories. What was she like? She asked gently. Ford exhaled. Strong. Too strong for my father. A dry chuckle. She didn't care about wealth or business. Just wanted a simple life. Dees studied his face. There was a sadness there buried deep. She would have liked you, he murmured before catching himself. His jaw tensed, and just like that, the walls slammed back up. I should go, he said abruptly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Dees standing there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Ford Okafor was still a mystery. But tonight, for the first time, she had seen a crack in his armor. And she wasn't sure what to do about it. Days passed, and something shifted between them. Ford still maintained his distance, still buried himself in work, but there were small changes. He lingered longer at breakfast. He acknowledged her presence with quiet nods. And sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her. It wasn't affection. Not yet. But it wasn't indifference either. An unexpected invitation. One evening, as Dees was reading in the library, Charles appeared at the door. Madam, he said respectfully, Mr. Okafor requests your presence at dinner tonight. Dees blinked. Dinner? She and Ford rarely ate together. He preferred taking his meals in his study, and she had learned not to question it. Yes, Charles confirmed. A formal dinner. He asked that you wear something elegant. Dees' heart pounded. Was this progress? Or just another calculated move in their arrangement? She had no idea. But hours later, as she stepped into the grand dining hall in a deep emerald gown, she found herself nervous in a way she hadn't expected. Ford was already there, seated at the head of the long table, dressed in a sharp black suit. When he saw her, his gaze flickered with something unreadable. "You look good," he said. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from Ford, it was something. "Thank you," she said softly. She took the seat beside him as servers brought out a gourmet meal. For the first few minutes, they ate in silence. But then, "I have a charity gala this weekend," Ford said abruptly. "I need you to come with me." Dees paused. "A gala?" Ford nodded. "It will be our first public appearance as a couple. The press will be there. Course. The perfect billionaire and his wife. Picture-perfect illusion." She swallowed. "All right." Ford glanced at her, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass. "I know this isn't what you wanted. If you feel uncomfortable." "I'll be fine," she interrupted. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Good." The rest of dinner passed without incident, but something about the night felt different. Not warmer, not softer, but different. And Adiz couldn't shake the feeling that slowly, she was being pulled deeper into Ford Okafor's world. A world filled with secrets and shadows. The night of the gala arrived faster than Adiz had expected. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in her dressing room, her emerald gown hugging her curves perfectly. The silky fabric shimmered under the chandelier light, and her makeup was flawless, soft, elegant, yet striking. But despite how beautiful she looked, she didn't feel like herself. Tonight she wasn't Adiz, the humble maid. She was Adiz Okafor, the billionaire's wife. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Ford stepped inside. For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her. His gaze traveled slowly from her face to the way the gown clung to her body. He didn't say the words, but for the first time Adiz saw it, appreciation. "You clean up well," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Adiz smirked. "That's the second time you've complimented me." Ford arched a brow. "Don't get used to it." She rolled her eyes, but her heart was beating a little faster. "Are you ready?" he asked, offering his arm. She hesitated only for a second before slipping her hand through his. And with that they walked out together side by side. The billionaire and his wife. The moment they arrived at the gala, flashing lights exploded around them. Reporters, photographers, journalists, all desperate for a glimpse of Ford Okafor and his mysterious new wife. Adiz had never been in the spotlight like this before. The cameras, the whispers, the envious stares from other women. It was overwhelming. But Ford, he was used to it. He walked with effortless confidence, his grip firm around her waist, guiding her through the chaos as if he had done it 1,000 times. To the world they were the perfect couple. But only Adiz knew the truth. This was nothing more than a performance. "Smile," Ford whispered against her ear. "You're my wife now. They need to believe it." Adiz inhaled sharply, forcing a smile as she leaned into him, playing her role perfectly. An unwelcome encounter. As they entered the grand ballroom, a waiter approached with champagne. Ford took a glass, but Adiz declined. She was about to speak when a woman's voice cut through the crowd. "Well, well, if it isn't Ford Okafor and his new wife." A stunning woman in a blood-red dress stood before them, her eyes sharp with amusement. She was tall, confident, and beautiful, the kind of woman Ford should have married. Ford's expression darkened. "Vanessa." Adiz's stomach twisted. She didn't know who Vanessa was, but the way Ford's jaw clenched told her everything. This woman wasn't just anyone. She was someone from his past. And from the dangerous smirk on Vanessa's lips, she was here to cause trouble. Adiz felt the tension the moment Ford's eyes locked with Vanessa's. There was history here. Dark, complicated, unfinished. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine, her red lips curling into a smirk. I must say, Ford, I didn't expect you to settle down so quickly. Ford's grip on Adie's waist tightened ever so slightly. I didn't expect to see you here, Vanessa. She laughed, a soft, mocking sound. Oh, come now. This is Lagos' biggest charity gala. Did you think I'd just vanish from high society? Her gaze flickered to Adie's, assessing, calculating. And you must be the lucky woman who tamed the untamable Ford Okafor. Adie smiled politely, even as unease curled in her stomach. We're very happy together. Vanessa tilted her head. Are you? Adie felt Ford tense beside her. Enough, Vanessa. But Vanessa wasn't done. She stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something almost cruel. Tell me, dear, she continued. Did Ford tell you about our little history? How we were once? Ford's jaw tightened. Walk away, Vanessa. Vanessa held his gaze for a beat longer, then laughed again, shaking her head. Oh, Ford. You were always so good at running. Then, with one last lingering look at Adie's, she turned and disappeared into the crowd. The aftermath. Adie's exhaled slowly. Who was she? Ford was silent for a moment. Someone I should have let go of a long time ago. His voice was cold, but there was something beneath it. Regret. Pain. Before she could ask more, Ford took her hand. Come. We're leaving. The rest of the night, he barely said a word. But when they got home, just as Adie's was about to head to her room, Ford spoke. I need you to understand something. His voice was quiet but firm. Whatever she said, whatever she tries to say in the future, don't believe her. Adie studied him. Why? A muscle ticked in his jaw. Because Vanessa thrives on destruction. And I won't let her ruin this. Ruin what? Adie wanted to ask. Their marriage. Their agreement. Or something else neither of them wanted to name. But Ford turned away before she could press further. And Adie was left wondering. What exactly did Vanessa mean to him? And why did she feel like this was only the beginning of something dangerous? The drive home was suffocatingly silent. Ford kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, his grip on the wheel firm. Adie could feel the tension rolling off him in waves, but she didn't know if she should push or let him be. Her mind kept circling back to Vanessa. Did Ford love her once? Did she break his heart? Or was he the one who left? She shouldn't care. This was just an arrangement. But deep down, the encounter had unsettled her in ways she didn't want to admit. Unspoken words. Back at the estate, Ford walked ahead, his long stride stiff with frustration. Ford, Adie called hesitantly. He paused but didn't turn. She stepped forward. Look, I know it's not my business, but... You're right, he cut in, his voice sharp. It's not. Adie flinched. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret maybe, but he didn't take the words back. She straightened. So, you expect me to just smile and pretend Vanessa didn't throw something in my face tonight? That she didn't look at me like I was some replacement? Ford exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. I told you. She's manipulative. She wants to get under your skin. She succeeded. Adie folded her arms. Because I'm starting to wonder if there's something I should know. Ford's gaze darkened. Vanessa was part of my past. That's all you need to know. Adie's stomach twisted. Was she someone you loved? Ford's expression hardened. Love. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. No. Vanessa doesn't love. She destroys. His words sent a chill down Adie's spine. Then his tone softened. Adie. This arrangement we have, it's already complicated. Don't let her get in your head. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But something in her gut told her that Vanessa wasn't done. And that Ford's past had more shadows than he was willing to reveal. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Adie tossed and turned, Vanessa's words looping in her mind. Did Ford tell you about our little history? She had no right to be bothered. This was a contract, nothing more. But something about Vanessa's smirk, her confidence, gnawed at her. What wasn't Ford telling her? A discovery in the study. The next morning, Adiz woke up with a lingering sense of unease. Ford had already left early for a business meeting, and the estate felt eerily quiet. By midday, she found herself wandering through the house, her steps aimless, until she stopped in front of Ford's study. She hesitated. Ford never explicitly told her to stay out, but it was understood this space was his. Still, curiosity burned inside her. Biting her lip, she slowly pushed open the door. The room smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Large mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with books and files. His desk was perfectly neat as expected, except for one thing. A single photograph sat in a silver frame. Adiz stepped closer, her breath catching. It was an old picture of Ford and Vanessa. Ford looked younger, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand on his chest, her smile full of mischief and ownership. Adiz's stomach twisted. He said he didn't love her. But this photo, it tells a different story. She reached out, fingers brushing against the glass. "What are you doing?" The deep voice sent a shock through her. She turned sharply. Ford stood at the doorway. His eyes locked onto the photograph in her hand. His expression was cold. Adiz's heart pounded. She hadn't expected Ford back so soon. She hadn't expected to be caught. And she definitely hadn't expected the look in his eyes. A mix of anger, regret, and something deeper. Slowly, she set the photograph back on the desk. She swallowed. "I was just..." Ford stepped forward, his gaze never leaving her. "You were just what?" His voice was calm, too calm. Adiz squared her shoulders. "I was curious." His jaw clenched. "Curious?" She met his stare head-on. "Who was she to you, Ford?" Silence. For a long moment, it felt like he wasn't going to answer. But then, he exhaled and walked past her, picking up the frame. "Vanessa and I were engaged once." His voice was distant, almost detached. Deez blinked. "Engaged?" "She was charming. Beautiful. Everyone thought we were perfect together." His fingers tightened around the frame. "I thought so too." Adiz stayed quiet, sensing there was more. Ford let out a humorless chuckle. "Then I found out she was using me." Adiz's breath caught. "She never loved me," he continued, his voice growing colder. "She loved my power. My money. And when I refused to let her manipulate me, she moved on." Deez frowned. "Moved on?" Ford finally looked at her. "She married my biggest competitor 2 months later." The words hung between them. Heavy. Adiz felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger for him, sadness, even understanding. "She didn't break my heart," Ford said, setting the photo down with a sharp click. "She just reminded me why love is a dangerous illusion." Adiz stared at him. For the first time she saw the real Ford Okafor. Not just the ruthless billionaire. Not just the dying man. But a man who had been betrayed. And suddenly this marriage, this arrangement made more sense. Ford wasn't just protecting his wealth. He was protecting himself. From love. From trust. From ever letting anyone close again. And Adiz. She wasn't sure whether to pity him, or be afraid of what that meant for her. The weight of Ford's confession lingered in the air. Adiz should have let it go. Should have walked away. But something inside her wouldn't. "Is that why you don't believe in love?" she asked softly. Ford's gaze flickered, but his face remained unreadable. "Love is an illusion, Adiz. One I can't afford." Her chest tightened. "But not everyone is like Vanessa." His expression darkened. "Maybe. But I don't take risks anymore." A part of her wanted to challenge him. Push. But what would be the point? He had already built his walls, and she wasn't supposed to care. So why did it bother her so much? An unwanted guest. That evening, Ford had a business dinner, leaving Adiz alone in the estate. She told herself she was relieved. She needed space to clear her head. But just as she was settling in for a quiet night, the doorbell rang. She frowned. The staff had already retired for the night. Who would visit this late? Curious, she made her way to the door and opened it, only to feel her stomach drop. Vanessa. The woman stood on the doorstep, draped in a sleek black dress, her lips curled into a knowing smile. "Hello, dear," she purred. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Adiz stiffened. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa let out a low chuckle. "Oh, don't be so tense. I just came to talk." Adiz crossed her arms. "Ford isn't home." "I know," Vanessa said, stepping forward as if she owned the place. "That's why I came." Something about her tone made Adiz's skin prickle. Vanessa's eyes swept over her. "You know, I was shocked when I heard about Ford's sudden marriage. He never struck me as the sentimental type." Adiz forced a smile. "Maybe you didn't know him as well as you thought." Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, I know Ford better than anyone." Her eyes gleamed with amusement. "Which is why I don't believe for a second that this marriage is real." Adiz's breath caught. Vanessa leaned in slightly. "Tell me, how much is he paying you?" Adiz's pulse pounded. "Excuse me." Vanessa smirked. "I mean, let's be honest. You're not his type. You're a maid, aren't you?" She cocked her head. "Or should I say we're a maid?" Adiz clenched her fists. "Leave." Vanessa chuckled. "Touched a nerve, did I?" She reached out, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from Adiz's shoulder. "Don't take it personally. Ford's just doing what he does best, making calculated moves." Adiz held her ground. "If that's what you believe, why are you here?" Vanessa's smile turned sly. "Because, darling, Ford always gets bored. And when he does, he tends to throw away what no longer serves him." Adiz's heart twisted. Vanessa leaned in one last time, her voice a whisper. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Then, with a satisfied smirk, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Adiz stood frozen, her hands trembling. She didn't want to believe Vanessa, but as the words echoed in her mind, she couldn't shake the fear creeping into her heart. What if she was right?